Um, Hello, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, I think I'm on. Excellent. Thanks so much for coming. Delighted that you're here, and delighted also to be welcoming Alan Rusbridger, sitting to my left. He is currently principal of Lady Margaret Hall College in Oxford. By the way, if you haven't seen it already, he wrote a fantastic piece for us in Prospect a couple of issues ago about why Oxford is, let's say, struggling or struggles to let in underprivileged students. And it's a tour de force, and it's also about how they could solve these problems with some interesting suggestions, some of them inaugurated at Lady Margaret Hall. So I'd recommend you have a look at it. But we're not going to be talking about Alan's current day job this evening. We're going to be talking about his previous day job, which was as editor-in-chief of The Guardian newspaper between 1995 and 2015, which he has written about, among many other things, leading on from the media in his new book, Breaking News. It was a truly momentous time in the history of news journalism. In 1995, there were just simply printed newspapers produced in different editions perhaps, but they were, in the main, accounts of what happened yesterday, with comment and features and sports, a sort of middle ground where everyone could meet and consider and discuss. But now, of course, newspapers don't just have websites, they are websites with maybe a print production operation on the side, not to mention all the panoply of Facebook, Twitter, Spotify, podcasts, iPhones, and all the rest of it. During his time at The Guardian, Alan did some pioneering work with the internet, which we'll talk about, but there was also some fantastic news stories that he broke as well, some of the biggest in national and indeed international politics, as he outlines in the book. The Jonathan Aitken libel trial, Edward Snowden revelations, Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, phone hacking trials, and these are just some of the things that he talks about in his book. So, Alan, there's plenty to get into, but I thought I'd just ask you first how you got into journalism in the first place, and whether it was always a passion for you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for coming. Well, the world was so different, so that was even further back in history. That was 1976. Not working.
What should I press on?
It says on. It's showing very little sign of light.
Ollie's just checking it. Yeah.
It looks dead.
Is it on? Ollie, do you want to come up? Should we get a substitute microphone?
Hello, can you hear that? Right, okay.
Yeah, great.
So what I was saying is that's even further back in history. That's 1976, and life was very simple then. If you wanted to work in Fleet Street, you first had to go and work on a local newspaper and do 2 or 3 years. You had to prove you could do shorthand, and then you had to read a book on law and local government, and then you could be a proper journalist. And that's what I did. And I had done sort of holiday jobs in journalism while at Cambridge, and decided this was fun. And so I left Cambridge, worked on the Cambridge Evening News, did my 3 years there, and then pitched up The Guardian.
And was The Guardian the place that you felt most attracted to because it was it had a certain mission to it, it had a certain sort of position that it came from that chimed with your own ambitions and your own worldview?
Well, the Times had turned me down for a job, and the Evening Standard turned me down for a job, so that was my third choice. It turned out once I got there, within 2 weeks I felt extremely happy and accepted, and it wasn't necessarily the politics that drew me to it, but the fact that they liked writing, and I could write a bit, I suppose, and it was a lovely experience of feeling that there was an incredibly like-minded, intelligent audience, so you could write at a certain level for them. If you made a joke, they would get the joke. Nobody told you what to write or what to think. You were just sort of sent out in the world. You wrote your piece, and by and large, they printed it. And that was known as a writer's paper. And there were lots of papers that weren't writer's papers where the opposite would happen, where you would be told what the story was, and then you had to go out and find it. And whatever you filed would then be very heavily edited in order to fit the worldview of the paper. But that was not The Guardian, so I felt immediately at home there.
So you became editor in 1995, which was just about the time that some newspapers had set up online versions of their paper or were thinking about it. In the discussions that you were having at the time, did you get a sense of how the internet was going to change the way newspapers were run?
Well, in 1994, I had gone to America to see the internet. I dare say I could have seen it in here, but it felt as though they were about 5 years ahead of us. Almost nobody was online then here. There was some sort of trial, rudimentary things going on, but if you flew to New York or Atlanta or Chicago, there were people in newsrooms doing the internet. And it was all terribly confused, obviously. The book really describes a revolution, and I thought it was important to try and explain what it's like to live in the middle of a revolution. But in 1995, nobody knew anything. So at the New York Times, there was a little unit working in the newsroom who seriously thought the internet would have nothing to do with news. They thought it would be quite good for sort of restaurant reviews or for arts, but they weren't thinking of it as a news thing. In Atlanta, I think it was in Atlanta, they had teamed up with AOL Online, and you had a sort of a CD disc. And nobody had any idea how to make money out of it. But the moment I saw it, it seemed to me inevitable that the story of print was going to go like that, and the story of digital was going to go like that. And you couldn't be more sophisticated than that. You couldn't put a time on it, and that was a sort of very crude thing that had to do with circulation and money, and ditto that. And so I was, by the time I took over as editor in 1995, that's the conviction I had in my head that print's days were numbered.
So even in '95, that was what you were anticipating. And were people looking at the website then? A lot of people at the time were thinking, well, if you have a website for a newspaper, that's a form of advertising for the main thing. That's the thing that you sell. How does it change the relationship between the reader and the person writing or editing the newspaper, if you think that this is not only going to the people who pay money and Guardian readers, but goes to potentially anyone in the English-speaking world?
Well, the funny thing is, before digital, we only had a very vague sense of the readers. I'm using big, broad brush generalizations, but we didn't really know what they were reading. We had things called marking and reading surveys, where you would have a group, half the size of this, and you'd give them a copy of The Guardian and some felt-tip pens, and they would put crosses on the pieces that they'd read after a couple of hours. And it was very difficult to interpret that. So usually, almost nobody was reading editorials. I think about 10% of readers would read an editorial. So as an editor, how do you treat that data? Do you think, we'll stop running editorials? Almost nobody read Hugo Young, but Hugo Young was the sort of leading columnist of the day. He came in at about 13%. So you had not a very good sense of what people were reading. Sometimes they'd write letters, which was nice, but you were completely in control of whether they got printed or not, or whether they would go in the bin. So that was sort of one view of the reader. And 20 years later, obviously, in newsrooms today, people are monitoring what readers are doing by the second. They know exactly how far down you're reading a particular kind of piece, or whether you're not reading about climate change, or whether you like these kinds of subjects or not. And so you've moved from not knowing much about your readers to a world in which you know everything and you want to know even more. But again, in 1995, that it wasn't clear that relationship was changing a lot immediately.
I think often in editorial meetings that I've been in, when people say things like, well, I'm not sure the readers would like this or subscribers would like this, often it is a proxy for what you actually think and what you're projecting onto to other people. But yeah, now, as you say, we can monitor much more closely what people actually are reading and thinking. So the idea of, Guardian Unlimited, as it was called, was the first incarnation of the Guardian online. And did you see that how it would change? Were people in the newsroom, were they worried about how it would affect the authority of the newspaper, or were they excited by the fact that you could have new and different voices commenting on articles and replying to your critics and columnists?
So that's jumping ahead a tiny bit, because I think there was this thing called Web 1.0, or it wasn't called Web 1.0, it was called the Web. And then at some point Web 2.0 happened. But so the Web 1.0 was Guardian Unlimited, which is effectively taking the Guardian, chopping it up, reimagining it for digital and distributing out there. And there was a kind of return channel, so people could talk back a bit. But it wasn't the huge transformation when suddenly everybody could talk to everybody, and we were a part of that conversation, but we weren't necessarily the main thing. The vertical arrangement of the world that came from having a printing press, not many people had those. And in 1995, you had few other sources of access to information. So you were very reliant on these 9 newspapers that were published in London, to a world 10 years later when there were multiple sources, and 20 years later there were multiple times multiple sources and 4 billion people talking to each other on a horizontal plane. And the struggle that journalism has had during those 20 years is to work out how, as it were, to regain the apparent authority that came from owning a printing press. So if people, as it were, handed up their money to you because you were a journalist, it was easy to confuse that as a journalist with feeling that you had sort of special power or knowledge or expertise, as opposed to just owning a printing press. And this is a very difficult thing for journalism to unlearn or to come to terms with.
You used a interesting phrase there, apparent authority. And I was wondering whether there's a sense of idealization of the old world of Fleet Street, when everything was fact-checked carefully and everyone was a professional, and there was none of these oiks telling you being rude under the line. But I wonder whether there were just lots of mistakes being made, but no one ever pointed them out, and whether we just have more things are being checked in real time now.
Yeah, I mean it's almost everything you say about everything has to be qualified. So, I mean, it was a lovely world to be a journalist before the internet. There was nothing not to like. There was money in the system. You could be paid to travel abroad, and nobody seriously could question your authority because, as I say, you were in control of the whole link of communication, and there was not much to double check it against. The idea of people having a public conversation about what you were printing or being rude about you, none of that existed. So it was a kind of charmed life to be a journalist, and again, no reason not to like it or to want to get back to it. But that's obviously gone forever. But were we? Was there a sort of fantastic standards of accuracy or fact-checking? Well, I mean, there were people called sub-editors who did a sort of magnificent job of correcting your spelling and your writing, and would come up and check on things. But I don't think anybody who was alive at that point would claim these were sort of great tablets of stone in which we handed down the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. I mean, for a start, it was all produced on a sea of alcohol. I mean, drunkenness like you've never seen, and there were these legendary characters who could sort of drink all day and then literally lean against a wall because otherwise they would fall over and dictate their, 1,500 words of peerless copy, and it was a great art, but maybe you shouldn't go back and sort of read those too scrupulously as perfect history.
So early on, The Guardian, under your editorship, did seem to make a decision that it was going to embrace the internet, as you said. And do you think that was easier for you in some ways because The Guardian had been and is, sort of liberal, open, internationalist kind of approaching newspaper, whilst for other kinds of newspapers, like, for example, I used to work at the Telegraph for 7 years, it was a lot more difficult to work out what that would look like online because it's sort of more conservative and inward-looking paper by its very nature. Do you think that there was a sort of coincidence of The Guardian's worldview and the technology that was available, becoming available?
Yeah, I think that is true. I mean, The Guardian's always been although it had a very small circulation, it was always the eighth, ninth biggest paper in Britain. So it was quite a sort of refined taste to be a Guardian reader, if I can put it like that. But I mean, there weren't many of them. But they tended to be liberal, progressive, internationalist, interested in abroad, and open-minded. And so it was. I'm sure that's right. That it was easier to imagine a world that you wanted to publish to, and over time, by about. After 9/11, we discovered that a third of our readers are now in America, and a third of them were in the rest of the world, and a third of them were in Britain, and that was interesting and fascinating, and you had to again readjust your journalism and think, well, we're not just writing for an audience of people in Wythenshawe or Stockbridge or now London and Scotland, but we're having to address people who live anywhere on the planet, and that inevitably changed what you wrote about and how you wrote about it.
The economics of how this all worked became challenging, and it still is a challenge for newspapers, because there was just less money around. And how would you fund this? And the ambitions that The Guardian had as a newspaper required money. And then there was the big question of whether you should charge or go behind paywalls and have discussions. And you write in the book that you were not ideologically committed to free, but you were committed to being open. What would you say is the distinction between that?
Well, so I tell a story in the beginning of the book. This was how not to work when you're trying to write a book. So I have a sort of Twitter screen open, which is a bad habit and bad destruction. And I use this story as a sort of illustration of the place we're now in. So on my Twitter screen there was a story about a rape in Malmö in Sweden, and it was a particularly graphic description, and the clear message of this tweet was these were Muslim men attacking Swedish women. That's what they do if you let them in, and they behave this barbarically. I won't trouble you with the detail, but it was a horribly unforgettable graphic detail of what had happened in this rape. And it said, mainstream media ignoring this, please retweet. And I went back to try and write the book, and I couldn't get this image of this tweet out of my head. And then I thought, I wonder if it's true. So I tweeted, hey, Swedish media, why are you ignoring this story? And all the Swedish journalists following me on Twitter said, we're not ignoring it. Here's a link. And so I followed these links and hit a paywall. And I thought, am I going to take out 9 krona for a monthly subscription to Dagens Nyheter? No, I'm not. So you see what had happened there. So what had happened was that the truth was there, but it was living in a gated community of people, of the minority elite, who were willing to pay for it. And what had happened was that the playing field had thereby been left open to any old neo-Nazi who wanted to inject lies into the information system. And so I followed the origin of this tweet, and it was a neo-Nazi called Peter Sweden 7, who's a Holocaust denier. And it took a day and a half to work out that this tweet was untrue. This thing that he had said hadn't happened. So that's the virtue of open. The open that if you could create a Guardian that was available for anybody in the world at scale, where a version of the truth was there, that would be a public good. That would be a public benefit. And contrariwise, if you put your reporting behind a paywall for rich people to buy, that might be something that you have to do because it might be the only economic model that worked. But shouldn't we try and do the open thing first? And that was the distinction between open and free. And I still think it's one of the most significant things in the ecosystem today. And I quote Dean Baquet, the editor of the New York Times, saying, which everyone holds the New York Times up as a great model and says it's great that the New York Times has found a financial model that works. Well, it has. But I was at a dinner with Dean when Dean said, I still worry, and Dean's an African American, that 3% of Americans now read the New York Times and 97% don't. And those 97% who aren't reading the New York Times are watching Fox News and other things. And the Swedes who aren't buying the Dagens Nyheter see what happened in the recent Swedish election. So if media are taking themselves off the playing field and populists are flooding onto the playing field, that's a problem for society.
In the last 2 years, we've had a reinvigoration of the kind of news values attachment to the idea of truth, facts, and in a way, as you write in the book, Trump has been good for those traditional values of newsmaking. But then there is always the question. Often this requires, talented people to be paid salaries, and they need an infrastructure. And how does that balance work if you're trying to give it away and spread all the good, true facts in the world when you maybe don't have the people to pay them to produce those facts?
Well, and funnily enough, The Guardian is making it work. So in 2012, we designed with Clay Shirky, who's a brilliant New York University professor. He came over and we had a weekend. I don't know if anybody was there. We had a weekend for Guardian readers in King's Place. And we began on this journey of a membership model, where instead of saying to subscribers, do you want to subscribe to The Guardian in order that you can read it over there in private and nobody else can, would you consider becoming a member of The Guardian and paying for it so that everybody can have it? So it's essentially a philanthropic model of subscribing in the same way that National Public Radio is or Wikipedia is. This week, The Guardian announced that 1 million Guardian readers are now consider themselves members, and that they're going to break even next year. So that seems to me a model, essentially a business model that we made about 5 years ago, and you have to be a bit long-term in this world, is working. And it depends on having fantastic journalism. So it depends on 1 million people thinking this paper is so fantastic and so important that people should be reading this viewpoint, that I'm willing to pay a certain amount in order that everybody can read it. So that's open journalism, and it's great that The Guardian seems to be making it work.
You spoke about fantastic journalism there. I want to talk to you about some of the big stories that you dealt with when you were editor of The Guardian. There's quite a few, maybe a couple of I think I find most interesting. Tell us a little bit about the Edward Snowden revelations, how that came about, and the sort of decisions that you had to take as an editor with lots of people breathing down your neck saying that this shouldn't be this shouldn't be happening, this shouldn't be being published?
Well, so the origins of Edward Snowden actually were in open journalism. So there's a man called Glenn Greenwald who we hired around about 2012 to 2013, and no one had ever told Glenn Greenwald how to be a journalist because he trained as a lawyer. So nobody had ever said, look, what you do is you write your story, press send, and then go down to the pub. You know, every journalist knows that's how journalism works. And Glenn, who worked from his kitchen in Rio de Janeiro with 13 rescue dogs, had this quaint idea that the moment you press send was the beginning of a story, not the end, because that's the moment that people would start to read it. And he was really interested in what they would think. So he would then make a cup of tea, sit down, and talk to the readers. And the readers would say, look, you've made a mistake in your second paragraph, or I think you could put a link in your fifth paragraph, or next week you ought to write about this. So by the end of a couple of hours, his story was better, because he had actually talked to readers, and he was interested to know if his story was right or wrong. By the time we hired him, he had 1 million readers, just on his own. One journalist, 1 million followers, who really trusted him. And one of those followers was a man called Edward Snowden, who was a 28-year-old contractee for the National Security Agency, who knew much more than Glenn Greenwald about what he was writing about. There's this sort of new media mantra that our readers know more than we do. Well, Edward Snowden was the classic reader who knew more than the journalist. So when Edward Snowden became very concerned about the firewall that needs to exist in any democracy between the government and the telecom providers or the West Coast giants, he went to Glenn Greenwald, and that's how The Guardian got the Pulitzer Prize for working on that great story. But it was a horrendously difficult story to do, ethically, legally, logistically, technically, and as you say, in the middle of it, the British government walked into the Guardian offices and had us destroy the machines that we were working on. It was always a sort of, to me, a bizarre thing to do, because we had a copy of them in New York. But nevertheless, they insisted on doing this, and there was this great pressure applied on us not to run this story.
And you formed sort of alliances with other newspapers. That was one of the most interesting things about that, because in a way you had defence in numbers, as it were, didn't you? If you have the New York Times on board, then that helps when it comes down to say to the British government, well, we don't publish it, then they will over there.
Yes, it was. I don't know if anybody saw the film about Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers. So that was the sort of crucial test of whether a government is entitled to stop a newspaper in advance. There's this phrase, publish and be damned, and as an editor you always know you will be ultimately responsible, but it should be almost impossible to stop a newspaper in advance from publishing. And that's what the Pentagon Papers were about, that Richard Nixon tried to stop the Washington Post and the New York Times from publishing the Daniel Ellsberg revelations of the Pentagon Papers. And the Supreme Court threw that out and said, no, actually, you would need to get over such a high barrier to the national security to be able to do that. And, of course, nobody now thinks Daniel Ellsberg was a traitor. Almost everyone would think Daniel Ellsberg was a whistleblower and something of a hero. And so in thinking about the Snowden story, I thought it's quite important to have a copy in America, because we don't have that First Amendment protection in Britain, and a government could come in and stop us. And that's exactly what they did. They did come in and said, unless you destroy all this, we will go to court to stop you. So the easiest thing in the world was just to hop across the Atlantic and edit it out of New York.
Edward Snowden, of course, ended up in Russia, right, where he is now. And that did lead some people to sort of question his motives or draw links and associations with the Putin government. Did you ever have any doubts that this was a genuine whistleblower?
Not many, no. I mean, it was worth thinking about that in the back of your mind, but my experience as an editor, it's best. I mean, you do think about the sources, motives, but the clinching thing is the documents. So, I mean, in actual fact, we were in direct contact with Snowden for about 5 days or a week. You know, he was in Hong Kong. We did 2 or 3 stories, and then he disappeared. And although I've been to see him in Moscow, that was the end of our contact with him. But we had the documents, and so you sit down with the documents and you say, well, what story are these documents telling us? So after that, we weren't dealing with him, and he'd done this extraordinary thing of actually handing everything to the journalists and saying, well, you choose. And in fact, I did a session with Snowden on Thursday. We dialed him into Oxford, and actually nobody. Yeah, I mean, it's been 5 years by now, and nobody serious in the intelligence world has ever come out and said they think he's a Russian asset or that he has a dodgy connection with the Russian state. So I think, I mean, I'd certainly assume that he was an idealistic, rather brave young man who did something important. You know, if it turns out in 50 years he was a Russian spy, I'm not sure I would greatly change my view of the story that we wrote.
It's one thing taking on the march of the British government and the US government, but taking on your peers in terms of Fleet Street can almost be equally challenging, as you found out when you started running stories about phone hacking. And Nick Davis, you write in the book, came to you with what he said was a big story, and it did turn out to be, in the end, massive.
Yes, that was that was difficult in its own way because there is a kind of sort of omerta in Fleet Street. You're not supposed to write about each other, and particularly as the economic circumstances of the press have got worse, there was a sort of encouragement that we all ought to be circling our wagons and firing outside, not firing inside. And you can understand that, but nevertheless, if a reporter walks through the door and says, I have evidence of a board-level cover-up of criminal behaviour in one of the largest companies in the world, I still think, I wonder how many of my editors, my colleagues presented with that would have said, well, we're not going to write that story because it's about a newspaper. If it was an oil company or a bank or a car company, we'd certainly write that story. If it was Toyota or Shell, yes, or HSBC, bring it on, but we're not going to do it because it's Murdoch. Maybe they would, but it seemed to me it was an impossible story not to write. But at the same time, it was going to be a very unpleasant story to write. And it turned out to be much more unpleasant than I had anticipated because of this. It was a story of a boardroom cover-up of criminal behaviour. So it was a story of corruption within a company. But what I learned when we started to publish this story was that the fear of Murdoch in British society was so widespread that nobody else wanted to touch it. So do you remember the police came out in the morning of the Millie Dowler story and said, well, this looks very suspicious. Sorry, it wasn't the Millie Dowler story. It was the original story of the James Murdoch cover-up, and said we will investigate this. It was a man, Inspector Yates of the Yard, and he came out at 10 o'clock in the morning and said, we'll look into it. And we thought, that's good, at last the police are going to investigate. Until 3 o'clock in the afternoon when he came out and said, we've investigated and we found nothing there. So you thought, well, that's not the most thorough investigation in Scotland Yard history. And then we realised that so the police were not going to do anything, and there was a regulator called the Press Complaints Commission, and they wrote a report blaming the Guardian, and no MPs really wanted to know, and the press didn't want to know. So you thought, actually, I hadn't appreciated that about Britain before. You always thought that there were checks and balances in British society, And if one bit fell over, another bit would hold up. And it was the first time I'd seen where all the bits, all the checks and balances fell over. Nobody wanted to take over Murdoch. And that was completely rational choice, because he so viciously went for people and their private lives using criminal means through the Sun and the News of the World, that it was a completely rational choice to think, well, actually, why take on this man? And that was another form of power that had to be held up to the light.
And at the beginning, the story seemed to be about celebrities and who they were sleeping with and footballers. But then as the story went on, it gradually became the victims, Millie Dowler, murder victim, and various others in public life, cabinet ministers had been hacked into and all the rest of it. So did you know at the start that it was going to be such a big story and involve so many important people? Did you sort of have a hunch, well, that it doesn't matter whether it's celebrities or whatever, it's still something that needs to be exposed?
No, but it was a much bigger story than we thought, and that's in a way how investigations tend to work. I mean, if you go back and read Watergate as it happened, Watergate was a series of incremental stories in the Washington Post that I'm sure even the news editors were bored of. When Woodward and Budstein said, "Hey, we've got another story," and this would be down page 3, bottom of page 1, page 7, and so these stories build up in increments. And all we knew when Nick first brought the story in was that, do you remember there was a man called Clive Goodman who had gone to jail, and they'd said that was just one rotten apple, and he was, and they sacked him, and they sort of drew a line there. And it turned out, in fact, that the whole newsroom were doing it, but we had about 4 names of people who were doing it. And we didn't know how many people had been hacked into, but we did know there had been £1 million payout to try and hush this up. And a policeman that Nick had met did say that he thought there were maybe a couple of thousand victims, and so we printed that, but we didn't know that. And of course, it turned out to be huge. And you're right. I mean, they were hacking into every cabinet minister they could, including Tessa Jowell, who was the culture minister at the time, who was responsible for the regulation of newspapers, and the people who would have been responsible for approving the Sky deal. And you had to wonder if they were trying to get dirt on their lives in order to get the business. I mean, you've no idea how this worked, because millions of emails at some point were destroyed, and the evidence trail went cold. But we now know that this was happening at the Mirror as well, and that the Mirror set aside £70 million to recompense their victims. And there's a series of cases in court at the moment which are not being reported. Sadly, Fleet Street's given up reporting the story, but you can find them on Twitter and through little niche publications. So the Sun is now in the firing line, and there are a lot of cases that are now coming up of people who said they were hacked into by the Sun, because the story was always okay. Well, we'll agree that the news world was at it, but nobody else in the company knew about it. And all these cases are now being settled with very large payouts at the courtroom door, in order to stop the discovery of documents that would show who further up in the company knew. So in a way, history is repeating itself now, except that no one's reporting it.
Ultimately, these revelations led to, as you said, the closure of the News of the World, but also the Leveson inquiry. Looking back now, do you think that Leveson really understood how newspapers worked, and were his solutions always going to be impractical and not accepted by the broad group of editors that of whom you're one?
Well, I mean, again, there's been a huge rewriting of history about Leveson, partly because of the muscle of newspapers who didn't want to be regulated. But there was, my sense of, after Leveson reported his report, there was a huge sense of relief. They thought, actually, we can live with this. We can live with most of this, we're never going to admit that, but it could have been much worse. And about a week after the Leveson report happened, there was a gathering of all the editors in Fleet Street at the Delaunay restaurant in the Aldwych. We all met for breakfast, and it was a meeting chaired by James Harding, who was then editor of the Times, but not for much longer. And James Harding brought Phil Webster, who was the political correspondent of the Times, in order to take minutes of this meeting. And there were something like 33 proposals from Leveson. And James said, well, we're going to go through these 33 proposals and work out what we can live with. And I quote the figures in the book. About 25 of them, everyone said, yeah, that's fine. And there are about 6 that we've got to work on. But so the mood of the meeting was, we can live with Leveson, and it was all ticked off. So we agreed we'd meet again to sort those last details out. So about a few days later, I said to James, can we see the minutes? And he said, well, some editors don't want the minutes circulated. I said, oh, that's interesting. Why is that? And he said, well, because they don't agree with what we agreed. And I said, well, that's fine, but they're minutes, If this was a local tennis club, or even the cabinet, quite, we would... and then what happened was, it was obvious that there were some people who were going to fight this, and so we stopped having meetings with all the editors around the table, and 2 or 3 elders of Fleet Street decided what was going to happen. And then suddenly the message turned that Leveson was a complete disaster, the greatest threat to the press that had ever happened, and we must fight it, and we were all obliged to fall into line. Which is a long way of saying that actually I think Leveson got most of it right. There were bits that went wrong afterwards in the negotiation of the sort of carrots and sticks that were intended to make it all work. But don't believe that Leveson was this sort of terrible jackbooted attack on the freedom of the press. It just wasn't.
Speaking of freedom of the press, we'll come to questions very soon because I know you'll have lots of things to ask. But one anecdote in the book which I thought was very interesting, going back to Jonathan Aitken in 1995, the famous libel trial. I think many of you will remember him armed with his what is it? The trusty sword of what is it?
Trusty sword of truth and
trusty sword of
shield of fair play.
Shield of fair play. And tell us a little bit about that, and also how Jonathan Aitken then sort of turned full circle, didn't he?
Well, it was one of those moments where it's acutely uncomfortable to be an editor. You switch on, somebody rushes into your office and says, switch on the TV. Jonathan Aitken is broadcasting live to the nation. And there he was. He just resigned as a cabinet minister in order to sue the Guardian with his trusty sword of truth. And said, I will see them in court. And of course, any editor then thinks, ooh, God, I hope we've got it right. And that's your first question. And your second question is, have you got George Carman's number? Because we need we need the best QC in the business. And I mean, you probably know the broad outlines that Aitken fights us all the way, and he's doing quite well in court. And he announces there was this day when it was Ascot, Ladies' Day at Ascot, and his QC said, we've got Ladies' Day in the court tomorrow. We're going to put Mrs. Aitken in court and Aitken's daughter, and they will sign their affidavits that will back his story, and it's game over. But what had been happening in the background was that our solicitor had done this completely mad and hopeless thing, which was the whole case turned on who had paid Aitken's hotel bill in the Hotel Ritz in Paris. At the same time, there were a lot of arms dealers who were also in the hotel, and the suspicion was that the arms dealers had paid Aitken's hotel bill, which was not really on because he was a cabinet minister at the time. So he said, my wife paid my hotel bill in cash. unlikely story, but there you are. If you're being sued in libel courts, it's your job. The onus is on you to prove it, and if you can't prove it, then you go down. And we couldn't prove it. I mean, we were really struggling. And Mrs. Aitken and the daughter were about to appear and say that we had lied. So we went on this hopeless mission in which a reporter was sent to the hotel in which Letitia Aitken had been staying in Switzerland. And it was such a mad mission, I almost didn't send on it, but our reporter Owen Bocott went. And what was the luck? What were the chances? When he got to this hotel, it had gone into receivership. And there was a security guy on the door, and Owen said, "Do you mind if I search through all your customer records?" And he said, "Sure, they're in the basement." So Owen went in, searched through a lot of shoe boxes full of paper records, because this was pre-digital, and finally came up with Letitia Aitken's payment. Faxed it home because he didn't know what it meant. And from that, we worked out that Letitia Aitken wasn't in Paris. She was in the hotel Bristol in Geneva or wherever it was. And that led to the most dramatic moment in a courtroom that anybody could ever remember, which was we got to 4 o'clock, Ladies' Day the next day, and George Carman hands up the facts of this bill. The judge looks at it, instantly sees the significance of this, hands it down to Aitken's team. They hand it to Aitken. Aitken looks at that, realizes this is the moment that his life is over. This is going to lead to jail. This is going to lead to bankruptcy. That evening, his wife left him, and he was completely impassive. You couldn't see what was going on inside his head. And that night, he put on a baseball cap and flew to Paris and then to America to flee what he knew was going to be the implosion of his life. And it was the most dramatic moment in court that anybody who was there on that day, they will all remember for the rest of their lives.
It's funny, I think these days you'd like to think that no one would try and get away with it, probably because you could track them all through their Instagram posts and know exactly where they were or what they posted on Twitter that day and their particular... but you never ever know. He went to the end. He went to your last day at the Guardian.
We're kind of friends now. It's somebody very mischievous. We were at the Hay Festival about I don't know 7 or 8 years ago, staying in a tidy bed and breakfast house, and somebody had booked Jonathan Aitken into the same house, and we both had tea together in the garden with the landlord and I said, "Jonathan, it's very nice to see you." "Alan, how are you? What have you been up to?" And the landlord was looking astonished. I had, eventually, effectively sent him to prison, and this was the first time we'd met. But he then wrote, he wrote a very good book about all this, and has now become ordained. And I got him down to Lady Margaret Hall last term. We were doing a thing about De Profundis, the great poem of Oscar Wilde. And I was thinking, I wonder who in public life could know what it's like to be in a prison cell having launched an unsuccessful libel action. I know, Jonathan Aitken. So he came down and we had a nice dinner. So we're friends now.
Fantastic. I want to open up. I know you'll have lots of questions. We are on microphone down, so all I can ask you to do is to speak very loudly, and what I might do is then repeat your question so that everyone else could hear. That lady there, who's got her hand up, yeah, in the green, got the green jumper.
Can I say, first of all, just express my gratitude for 20 years of wonderful reading, and that somebody somewhere was following up the big stories and going into frontiers which other people weren't prepared to investigate.
Thank you.
On that note, noticing at the moment that Carol Cadwallader is having a number of issues, she and Harding, in getting the story out about Aaron Banks into the wider media. You spoke about the Code of Omerta. Do you think that there is something of that nature going on with regard to this particular story? If I'm making super greedy assessment, just to say, which is the story that you've broken that has caused you the most stress when considering whether or not to publish?
So 2 questions there about the Observer and its stories about Aaron Banks and whether there's anything unusual going on there with the rest of the media, and which stories caused you the most stress.
Well, it would have been an easy book to write, and I found I couldn't write this book in the end, to say social media is horrible, and thank God we've got the British press, because the British press is so wonderful. And one of the reasons I couldn't write that book was because of Brexit, because I was a civilian by then, and I kind of knew instinctively that Brexit was going to be a very complicated story. I don't think I was wrong there. But we were being told it was a simple story. And most of the British press were only telling one side of the story. And not only telling one side of the story, they were more or less instructing their readers how to vote. And that didn't strike me as what journalism should be about. And so I don't know. I mean, Carol Cadwallad's been having a horrible time on Twitter, including from people like Andrew Neil, who should know better. But I don't know whether the sort of lack of take-up of what seems to be a really serious scandal about the undermining of a democratic vote, why that hasn't got much play in the media. But it might be that if you start off with such a mindset in which Brexit good and anything else bad, that if it looks as though that vote was dodgy, that you're not going to put the resource into following that up. And so it feels to me that it has got sort of slight echoes of these stories like Snowden and like phone hacking, when we were very much on our own and you looked around for cover. And there wasn't much. Although, to be fair to the BBC did pick up on phone hacking eventually. So I mean, I sympathise with how she must feel and admire her persistence in carrying on. I mean, the story that was hardest was the Snowden story, because it's so obviously such a fraught territory to get into, and very, very powerful people, in America and Britain, seriously not wanting you to write those stories. And people, you have to be judged on how you did them. The one thing that I think you can't do, this was an argument that 1 or 2 British journalists made, which went as follows: if the British government tell you not to write a story, then who am I to disagree with that? And I just think that's a fundamentally, if you really think that, then you shouldn't be a journalist, honestly. Because the whole point of journalism is to stand apart from the state. And there have been so many instances in history when the British government and other governments have told journalists not to write things, Richard Nixon and Daniel Ellsberg, because they're going to be a threat to security or whatever. You can't mount that argument. You can say the Guardian is behaving disgracefully and printing this stuff irresponsibly, and they shouldn't have run this story, that story, but you can't start from the assumption that the Guardian has no right to run that story. But nevertheless, it was a very fraught story to run, and the one that gave me most sleepless nights.
Someone else, gentleman here at the front.
Yes, can I ask you about the sort of pre-internet, pre-history of Fleet Street? Back in 1986, there was a long strike in Fleet Street with Rupert Murdoch, which he eventually won. And before that time, there was chaos with the print workers' strikes all the time. And in the end, the print workers lost. And I think they were able to produce newspapers for what, half or a third of the cost before. Is there a case of saying that Rupert Murdoch, in a funny sort of way, saved Fleet Street? Would Fleet Street, would the newspaper industry have, if Rupert Murdoch had lost and the print workers had won, all the old practice would have persisted, would Fleet Street the newspaper industry look very different today.
Yeah. So would Rupert Murdoch, winning against the strikers in the 80s, did he slave Fleet Street?
I mean, I do think. I mean, at the time, it was an act of such boldness. I mean, incredible. If you remember what he did, you know, he had all his papers in the centre of London, and unknown to anybody, he had built a printing press, you know, 2 miles away in the Isle of Dogs, and nobody had noticed this. And he shipped in a sort of plane loads of Australians who knew how to work computers. And then suddenly on a Friday night, he informed his entire staff, by the way, next Monday you turn up at the Isle of Dogs, and we're going to be printing on these entirely new printing presses, and by the way, you're going to be using computers, and we're going to sack all the printers. Absolutely incredible thing to do. And looking back, it was brutal, but it was, somebody had to do something like that, because the print, there was going to be no concessions from the print unions. So I think it would have got there eventually, because it's happened everywhere. You know, I mean, the print unions in America were very strong, and in France and Germany too. So it was a brutal thing to do, and I think he certainly accelerated what would have been inevitable. I mean, the other thing that simultaneously happened was the flotation of Reuters, and all the newspapers which had shares in Reuters suddenly were able to materialize and get an awful lot of money. And that was the other thing that saved. So those two things, the flotation of Reuters and the Wapping dispute between them, was certainly, in retrospect, the two things that did in a way save Fleet Street.
Anyone over here want to? Hopefully we'll get to everyone. Gentleman there at the back, and we'll come to you.
I wanted to ask you something about your relationship with your publisher, because in film you always see that government officials always call the publisher and not the editor, and then the publisher expresses concerns about the story that they're going to talk about. What was your relationship with the publisher, and how much were they involved in editorial decisions?
Who do you mean by publisher? Do you mean the sort of yeah, okay, so we didn't have a publisher because we had no proprietor. So most editors have somebody above them who is Rupert Murdoch or Richard Desmond or the Barclay brothers or Robert Maxwell or Conrad Black. I mean, a lot of them went to prison, but we didn't have anyone.
Only some
like
of them
that.
went to prison. Let's just make that clear.
Two of them went to prison. So and one of them worked for the KGB, but we didn't have one of those, and one of them was a pornographer. So I didn't have to go and ask permission of anyone. We did have a managing director, and we had a chair of the Scott Trust who was constitutionally not encouraged to have any views on what was going to the paper. So, but you know, before a big story like phone hacking or Snowden, I would certainly go and have a chat with the managing director and say, not to ask their permission, but just to inform them. And the defence of the Aiken libel action, which involved a stake of many millions of pounds. Was certainly a decision where I stayed close to the managing director and showed her our legal hand, and she would sit in meetings with me. And at the point when Granada, we were fighting this action with Granada TV, and their insurers threw in the towel halfway through the libel action, and I was very dependent on the managing director saying, no, I agree with you, we're going to fight on, and I'll give you the money to do so. So it was that kind of relationship rather than asking for someone's permission to publish, which I think most editors have to.
It also gives you a lot of responsibility then, extra responsibility.
You have responsibility.
Yeah, no, I mean, because there's no one above to talk to, it's a different way of editing. So all my conversations were with the staff, with colleagues. One of whom's in the room today, who I work very, very closely with. And you'd have endless collegiate discussions, but that's very different from trying to double guess what somebody up there would want you to do or would not want you to do, or whether they've got friends that you're about to upset. Or luckily, I mean, it's a blessed position being the editor of The Guardian, because you just don't have those calculations.
Gentleman over there.
Yes, thank you. My question is with regard to the editorial responsibilities to the individual safety of journalists. We've read about Yemen physical violence, Slovakia, Malta, but now we have all of the and verbal violence as a good case in point. Is it possible to say, as an ex-editor, where your responsibilities start, if anywhere, and potentially where they end with regard to the safety of your colleagues?
And protecting journalists, their safety, both on assignments and online as well. Yeah.
Well, one of the things I wanted to write about in the book was the institution of a newspaper, because if you can't defend your stories, you might as well not write them. So you have to have institutional strength, which includes somebody on the commercial side being prepared to bankroll Nick Davis for 7 years as he's writing those stories, and understanding why that would be important for a newspaper. And it includes defending things in court when you come under attack, or if the government smashes up your computers, you have to be able to go on public. So that's kind of institutional strength. And that includes for the safety of correspondence. And that's a complicated thing. I don't know if anybody has been reading Lindsay Hilson's book about Mary Colvin. And I think she poses uncomfortable questions about the relationship between a newspaper and a correspondent who is brave, going on beyond brave, whatever that word is. I don't want to use a pejorative word, but it was clear that Mary Colvin went into places that other correspondents wouldn't. And there were people like that on The Guardian. There were correspondents who got perpetually into danger, or always being kidnapped, or disappeared off the radar. And there were reporters there were photographers who, when you looked at their footage or their frames, you thought, actually, I'm very uneasy about this. You shouldn't have put yourself in this position in which you could have been killed. But you're dealing with people who are doing extraordinarily brave things because they believe that the world needs to have this information. They're on the ground, you're not. You can sometimes pull them out and tell them not to do things, but sometimes they will override you and say, well, look, I'm going in with X, or I'm doing Y. Trust me, it's going to be all right. There's PTSD. There are severe mental stresses on people doing these jobs and seeing horrible things. And there are freelancers, and there are fixers, people who are not on the staff, but who we know get sometimes killed, and they may be translators or drivers. And what's your responsibility to them? And so there is all that side of things, and we thought of them a lot, and sometimes, there were occasions when we had to move camp beds into the office and sleep in the office and have security people because a journalist had gone missing or was being kidnapped, and we had to somehow get him or her out.
Gentleman here at the front, maybe a couple more questions and then we'll finish.
A very naive question. Is there any way that a sense of ethics can be brought back into the ownership of newspapers? Because you're the only one I consider an ethical newspaper. You're owned by a trust, therefore there's no individual behind it. I had one experience with Mr. Murdoch when I tried, because I'm very keen on Europe, and I thought that maybe a big TV series about the shared history of Europe would be a wonderful way of making people throughout Europe think in terms of our shared history and values and so on. So I arranged to meet Mr. Murdoch through Australian friends. He was absolutely charming, also very executive. I mentioned the word Europe and he said, I mean, the whole thing was over in 2 seconds. I don't believe in Europe. Right. So that was that. So we were stuck and we had to be polite to each other for another 10 minutes.
See.
After that, one sees, you know, what his press is doing about Brexit and so on. How can one find a way whereby ethics at least allow a reasonably, shall we say, level playing field when a subject as important as Brexit comes along and his paper is not so vindictive, his group of papers are not so vindictive, or other owners incidentally, not so vindictive about Brexit, but try at least to inform the public in a sensible way. So how do you ethicize these sort of people, if it's possible?
Yeah, well, that's a huge and important question, and the difficulty is, as Leveson showed, trying to find any system of regulation or self-regulation that at the same time preserves the complete independence of the press is a really difficult thing. So it's really difficult to think how you would get any kind of, quotes, control over someone like Murdoch. That wouldn't just look horrible and probably be horrible. So I wonder if this is a way of looking at it, that the Brexit and climate change, I've said, are the stories where it seems to me, if the survival story of the press is we're better than all that stuff out there because you can really rely on us to make you a genuinely informed citizen about complicated choices, then it wouldn't look like Murdoch's line on Brexit. The Times was different, and it wouldn't look like how the British press covers climate change. So, as a sheer matter of survival, I think the press is going to have to ethicize themselves, because otherwise you can't make a case for journalism unless it's more ethical, more better, more reliable, more useful, more trustworthy than the stuff that 4 billion people are producing. I think there are things around ownership that you can do. I mean, I think it was wrong that Murdoch should have been allowed to own 40% of the British press. That's a dangerous amount of concentration in one hand. And crazy that we ever thought of allowing him to own Sky TV and Sky News on top of that. So I think there are sort of levers you can do about regulation of ownership and share of ownership. But beyond that, I think unless the press can get its act together and prove that it's better, then it doesn't deserve to survive. On climate change, it's on the same theme. There's a man called James Delingpole. Has anyone heard of him? So
My former colleague.
Your former colleague. Well, I hope that. So he's the go-to guy on climate change, and so if you don't know who he is, he's a sort of clown who's an English graduate of a famous university 60 miles to the west of here. But he doesn't know anything about climate change. But nevertheless, he is the climate change correspondent of Breitbart, and you could think, well, that doesn't matter because it's just Breitbart. That's the internet, but we're the press. We're better than that. I mean, it kind of does matter because Trump reads Breitbart, but and he doesn't believe in climate change. He just doesn't believe it. He thinks it's all got up by the liberal elite. And you think, well, fine, if you want to believe that and you want to write about that, terrific. Until you put Delingpole's name into a search engine, and he's all over the British press. He's in the Telegraph, he's in the Mail, he's the Express, he's the Sun. He is the go-to guy for climate change, and I just can't understand it. If you want to survive as the press and say we're better, you know, the internet is full of lies and mad people, but our business model is that we're going to be better than that. Why would you get James Delingpole to write about climate change? And it seems to me the same issue. You know, in the end, people will laugh at the papers that use James Delingpole on climate change, and they will think, well, we can't trust this paper, and they would be right.
It's an open question, I think, whether James Denning Pole believes that he doesn't believe in climate change, but anyway. We'll leave him to speak for himself. He can send us a tweet. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, but we'd love to continue the conversation. Alan has very kindly agreed to sign some books upstairs, so please do carry on, come and have a chat. There is also a drinks reception, which you're all welcome to come to. Thank you so much for coming. Just a bit of housekeeping. Next month, for those of you who were interested in Dermot McCulloch talking about his new book about Thomas Cromwell, unfortunately he's had to delay that event until May. So instead, next month we've got Julian Bagini, prospect columnist and philosopher, talking about his book about world philosophy. It should be great, so please do come along as well. But most of all, please express your appreciation for Alan and his wonderful talk this evening. Thank you.